She was a billionaire titan in a custom emerald green power suit. He was a broke roadside mechanic with hands stained by the ghosts of old engine oil. When her luxury vehicle died on a road to nowhere, their worlds collided in a cloud of red dust, and what began as simple engine trouble fueled a journey of war, betrayal, and a love that neither of them saw coming. You won't believe how this incredible story ended. If you're just tuning into this channel, please subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to share with your friends and family, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments section. If someone had told Amara Williams that her luxury sedan would embarrass her on a pothole-ridden road in the middle of nowhere on the most important day of her career, she would have laughed in their face and ordered another bottle of expensive champagne. But life didn't send memos to billionaires. That morning, she looked every bit the Lagos Titan, adorned in a sharp suit and a string of pearls that whispered of old money and new, unyielding power. The land acquisition meeting in a jetty was set for 11 a.m. sharp, and 3 other massive multinational firms were already circling the same territory like vultures. She had the data, the legal leverage, and the billion-naira vision. What she didn't have was a working engine. As the steering stiffened and the brutal village heat slapped her face like a bad debt, Amara realized that for the first time in her life, her bank balance couldn't buy her a way out of this silence. The dusty heat of a jetty continued to punish Amara as she stood beside her stalled silver sedan. Out here, her status felt as hollow as the silence coming from her engine. The car had made one final ugly grunt, a sound like a drunk goat coughing, before dying completely. She had pressed the ignition until her thumb was sore and her panic was rising, but the vehicle remained stubbornly, evilly dead. Panicked and sweating, she stepped out, her designer heels sinking into the soft, treacherous dirt of the roadside. She checked her phone, raising it toward the sky and walking in frantic circles as if searching for a signal at a holy shrine, but the screen showed nothing but a mocking no service. This was supposed to be her crowning achievement, but instead, she was trapped in the middle of nowhere while her competitors prepared to snatch her deal. "God, I beg o," she muttered, flinging the bonnet open and staring into the mechanical maze as if it would suddenly explain its own failure. No explanation came, only the shimmering, mocking waves of heat rising from the asphalt. Just as she was about to let out a heartfelt curse, she heard footsteps. They weren't the hurried, aggressive steps of a Lagos hustler. They were the calm, unbothered gait of someone who slept in peace even when the world was on fire. She turned to see a man approaching. He was tall and dark, wearing a faded shirt and trousers heavily stained with engine oil. A grimy towel was slung across his shoulder, and his face held a rugged no-nonsense look that made Amara instinctively straighten her suit. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't frowning either. He simply looked at the car and then at her. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice sounding as smooth as early morning pap. Amara exhaled, her CEO composure finally cracking under the weight of the afternoon sun. "It just stopped dead. I have a meeting in less than 30 minutes, and now this car has decided to disgrace me." She gestured to the vehicle in total frustration, her pearls catching the harsh midday light. The man didn't ask for her name, her business card, or her title. He simply stepped forward with an air of quiet authority. "Can I take a look?" For a woman who usually demanded a full resume and 3 references before a handshake, Amara didn't hesitate. Her corporate pride was no match for the desperation of the ticking clock. "Please," she whispered. Ibuka leaned into the bonnet with a practiced ease that suggested mechanics was second nature to him. He checked the oil stick, the battery heads, and the radiator cap with rhythmic precision. "Oil's dry. Water's low too," he announced, wiping his hands on his oil-stained trousers. "You're lucky the engine didn't knock." Amara winced, remembering the frantic, careless pace she had set that morning. "I think I have engine oil in the boot," she said, hurrying to the back of the car. She rummaged through her luxury bags until she found the bottle, holding it up with both hands like a rescued infant. Ibuka took it without a word, poured it in quietly, and then turned back toward the path. "I'll get water. There's a compound close by." Before she could even offer to follow or provide help, he was already walking away, his back moving like someone who didn't owe the world an apology or a single second of his time. 10 minutes later, he returned carrying a heavy keg. "I borrowed it from my uncle," he said with a faint, dry chuckle. "He'll still insult me later for taking it, but at least we'll fix this first." As he poured the water carefully into the radiator, Amara truly looked at him for the first time. His eyelashes were unfairly long for a man covered in grease, and his jaw had just enough stubble to earn her respect. He wiped the excess water away, shut the bonnet with a firm click, and looked at her with unreadable eyes. "Start it now." Amara slid into the driver's seat, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She turned the ignition, and the engine purred like a satisfied cat. A smile spread across her face like sunlight hitting wet clothes. She jumped out of the car, her relief nearly overwhelming her. "Oh my God, thank you. Thank you so much." She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a stack of crisp, high-denomination Naira notes. In her world, every service had a price, and she was prepared to pay handsomely for her rescued career. "Please, at least let me pay you for your time and the trouble," she said, holding the money out with a shaking hand. Ibuka looked at the notes and then back at her eyes, his expression unchanging. He simply shook his head. "No need. I didn't do anything special. Just oil and water." Amara stood frozen, the money still clutched in her hand. "You're sure?" she asked, her voice sounding small against the vastness of the village road. He didn't answer with words. He just gave a short, final nod and began walking back toward the village, his figure soon becoming a silhouette against the rising dust. She stood there, a billionaire watching a poor man walk away from a fortune, stunned that someone with so little would refuse so much from a woman who thought she had everything. Little did Amara know that this man was not just a mechanic. Ibuka was a brilliant engineer who had been betrayed and robbed of his legacy by those he trusted most. And little did Ibuka know that the woman he just saved was the only person with the power to help him take it all back. Amara Williams did not just walk into the community meeting in a jetty. She arrived like a force of nature that had just conquered the elements. Despite the dusty ordeal on the roadside, she had managed to clean her signature heels and straighten her emerald green suit, appearing before the Council of Elders with the poise of a woman who had never known a moment of panic in her life. The presentation was flawless. She spoke of agro-processing, community development, and a vision that made the proposals of the three competing multinational firms look like uninspired scribbles. When she finally stepped out of the hall, the land deal was hers, sealed with handshakes and the kind of respectful applause reserved for those who command the room. By all accounts, it was one of the most significant victories of her career, a billion-naira move that should have seen her popping champagne in Victoria Island by sunset. Yet, as she drove her silver sedan back toward the city, the triumph felt strangely quiet. Her mind was not on the paperwork sitting in the passenger seat or the congratulatory messages blowing up her phone. Instead, it kept drifting back to the red dust of the roadside and the man with the oil-stained towel slung across his shoulder. Ibuka. She hadn't even asked his name at the time, but his image was burned into her memory with more clarity than the contract she had just signed. She found herself gripping the steering wheel, listening to the smooth purr of the engine, the same engine he had brought back to life with nothing but water, oil, and a calm expertise that didn't care for her bank balance. Back in her glass-walled office in Victoria Island, the Lagos skyline glittered outside, but Amara felt a disconnect. She sat at her mahogany desk, a gold pen dangling uselessly from her fingers as she stared out at the Atlantic. Usually, she was a woman of relentless action, a CEO who moved from one war to the next without blinking. But today, the untouched paperwork in front of her seemed trivial. She was haunted by the way he had looked at her crisp Naira notes and simply shaken his head. In a world where everyone wanted a piece of her, where every smile was a transaction and every favor came with an invoice, Ibuka had walked away without asking for a thing. Amara. She blinked, coming back to the present. Her best friend and chief operating officer, Neka, was leaning against the doorframe, her arms crossed and a knowing smirk playing on her lips. Neka had been with her since the beginning. She knew the exact frequency of Amara's professional heartbeat, and right now, the rhythm was off. You've been staring at that same patch of ocean for 10 minutes, Neka said, stepping into the room and placing a folder on the desk. The Ajeti deal is closed. The board is ecstatic. So, why do you look like you're lost in a village forest? Amara scoffed, attempting to reclaim her boss persona. I'm just tired, Neka. It was a long drive. Please, Neka rolled her eyes, moving closer. I know that look. That's not long drive tired. That's who is he, tired. You've been daydreaming since you got back. Did some handsome local chief catch your eye? There's no he, Amara insisted, though her slight hesitation gave her away. She thought of Ibuka's unfairly long eyelashes and the way his jaw looked under the afternoon sun. She thought of the rugged no-nonsense grace he possessed, a man who lived in a world of dust but seemed to have more peace than anyone she knew in the city. He's just a mechanic, Amara murmured, almost to herself. My car broke down on the way to the meeting. He fixed it. I offered him enough money to change his life, and he wouldn't take a kobo. He didn't even care who I was. Neka's smirk softened into genuine curiosity. In this Lagos? A man refused your money? Maybe he's a ghost, Amara. Or maybe he's exactly what you need to remind you that the whole world isn't for sale. Amara didn't answer. She looked down at her hands, clean manicured, and holding a pen that cost more than a village house, and remembered his hands, dark and stained with the honest grime of his craft. He had treated her Range Rover like a living thing that needed help, not a status symbol to be exploited. As the sun began to set over Lagos, casting long shadows across her expensive carpet, Amara realized that the land deal wasn't the most important thing she had found in Ajeti. She had found a question she couldn't answer. Why did a man with nothing seem so much more fulfilled than a woman who had everything? The memory of his voice, smooth like early morning pap, echoed in her mind, making the high-rise office feel suddenly cramped and artificial. She was a billionaire, a titan of industry, a woman who won every war she fought. But as she stared at the phone she had raised to the sky in a desperate search for a signal, she knew she was going back. She wasn't going for a deal or a contract. She was going because the complete evil silence of her broken car had been replaced by a different kind of silence in her heart, one that only the mechanic in the dust seemed to understand. Amara Williams spent the next 48 hours in a state of high-functioning restlessness. By all objective measures, she should have been celebrating the Ajeti land acquisition, but the victory felt hollow against the backdrop of her luxury high-rise office. Every time she closed her eyes, she didn't see spreadsheets or architectural renderings. She saw red dust and a man whose rugged no-nonsense face held more dignity than all the boardrooms in Victoria Island. She was a billionaire who had built her empire on war and calculated transactions, yet she had been humbled by a man who treated her money like it was mere paper. The decision to go back was not a business move, though she told herself she needed to properly thank him. Deep down, she knew it was the silence, the way Ibuka had looked at her without needing anything from her, that was pulling her back toward the village. On Wednesday afternoon, Amara did something her staff would have found incomprehensible. She bypassed her crisp white jumpsuits and signature heels for a soft black blouse and simple denim jeans. She traded her designer stilettos for a pair of sensible flats. Without a driver, without an assistant, and without the protective armor of her CEO persona, she got behind the wheel and let her memory guide her down the road she now knew too well. As the asphalt turned to gravel and the gravel turned to the characteristic red earth of Ajeti, the air began to change. The frantic high-stakes energy of Lagos was replaced by a slow, heavy heat that didn't care about her schedule. When she arrived at the junction where her car had once disgraced her, the sky was already beginning to tilt toward a soft evening gold. She parked her silver sedan and stepped out, feeling the ground beneath her flats in a way she never could in heels. Walking into the heart of the village, Amara felt like a foreign object dropped into a settled pond. The ripples were immediate. Her presence was a most interesting conversation before she even opened her mouth. As she neared a small provision store, she encountered the gatekeepers of local information. Mama Rotamai and Mama Rita were standing by the storefront, their wrappers tied tight and their eyes narrowing as the Lagos lady approached. The glares were suspicious and heavy with the slow, calculating weight only seasoned village women could pull off. Mama Rotomai adjusted her glasses, her gaze traveling from Amara's clean flats up to her face, then back down to the car parked in the distance. Amara offered a polite, practiced wave, but the response was a wall of silence from one, while the other gave a nod so slight it was almost invisible. They didn't need to speak for Amara to hear the unspoken question. What is this woman in the fine car doing here again? Is it only engines she is coming to check? Amara took a deep breath, pushing past the discomfort of being an outsider. She wasn't here to sign a contract. She was here to find the man who had asked for nothing. She approached a nearby compound and knocked on a weathered gate. An elderly woman opened it, her expression guarded until Amara mentioned the man who had helped her with water and oil. "Ah, that should be Ibuka," the woman said, her face softening just a fraction. "He is my nephew. His shop is down that path, near the blue umbrella and the tires." Amara thanked her and followed the narrow path, her heart beating with a strange, nervous anticipation she hadn't felt in years. The village was quiet, the only sounds being the distant bleat of a goat and the laughter of barefoot children chasing plastic bottles. Then she saw it, the blue umbrella and the man beneath it. Ibuka was crouched beside a rusty vehicle, his hands deep in the engine, lost in a quiet conversation with his young apprentice, Courage. He looked up as she approached, his gaze slow and unreadable. He didn't look impressed by her return. He simply stood up and wiped his hands on a rag, his face as calm as the evening air. "You came back," he said, his voice as smooth as she remembered. Amara smiled, a genuine, unforced expression that rarely reached her face in the city. "I had to thank you properly," she said, holding out a small gift bag filled with high-quality oil, gloves, and wipes, items he could actually use, rather than the money he had already rejected. As they stood there in the dust of his shop, Ibuka gestured toward a worn wooden bench. For the first time, Amara sat down in a place where her bank balance meant nothing, and for a moment, the billionaire and the mechanic just watched the sunset together in a silence that finally felt like peace. The evening air in Ejeti had grown thick and heavy, the kind of dry heat that left even the flies too tired to buzz as the sun dipped below the horizon. Amara sat on the low, weathered bench near the blue umbrella, her designer jeans a stark contrast to the dust-caked tires piled nearby. Beside her, Ibuka remained standing, his silhouette tall and rigid against the fading light, looking like someone confessing a heavy truth in a court where he expected no mercy. For a long time, the only sound was the distant bleat of a goat and the rhythmic scraping of his apprentice, Courage, tidying up the shop in the background. Amara stayed quiet, sensing that the wall of silence Ibuka had built around himself was finally beginning to crack. "I wasn't always a roadside mechanic in a place no one can find on a map," Ibuka began, his voice dropping into a low, somber register. He told her about Lawson Automations, the company he had co-founded in Lagos with a dream and a small shed. It had started with pure passion, fixing cars and integrating advanced tech designs that no one else in the country was thinking about yet. They brought in investors, and almost overnight, the business blew up into something massive. Amara listened without blinking, recognizing the trajectory of a rising star in her own corporate world. But as Ibuka spoke, his jaw tightened, and the pain he had been hiding behind his no-nonsense eyes finally surfaced. He spoke of Fola, his ex-wife, who had been the heart of the company's marketing and administration. He described her as a sharp, brilliant woman, but admitted he had been too deep in the building phase, too focused on expansion and prototypes, to see the rot spreading underneath his own roof. "I didn't want to believe the whispers," he muttered, his voice laced with a bitterness that years of isolation hadn't managed to dull. By the time he realized the depth of the betrayal, the foundations of his life had already been hollowed out. Fola hadn't just left him, she had systematically dismantled his legacy from the inside. The betrayal had a face and a name: Tund, Ibuka's biggest rival and the CEO of GT Engines. While Ibuka was working late nights in the lab, Fola was leaking his proprietary designs to Tund, handing over the keys to the kingdom to the very man who wanted to see Ibuka fail. "She was having an affair with him behind my back the whole time," Ibuka said, a short, humorless laugh escaping his lips. Amara's breath caught in her throat. She knew GT engines. They were the same aggressive competitors who had been gunning for her own contracts at Colagrote for the past year. Ibuka described the cold, calculated way they had forced him out of his own company, using the very designs he had spent his life perfecting. They robbed him blind, taking his intellectual property, his reputation, and his marriage in one fell swoop. The legal battle had been a slaughter. Tund had deep pockets and deeper connections, and Ibuka, broken and betrayed by the two people he trusted most, had simply given up the ghost. He had fled the high-rise offices and the war of Lagos for the silence of a jetty, choosing poverty and a dusty shop over the constant reminder of what he had lost. As he finished, he looked down at his oil-stained hands, the hands of a man who could fix anything with a motor but couldn't repair his own shattered trust. "They all say they want to help," he said, glancing at Amara with a sudden, sharp suspicion that made her flinch. "But how do I know you're not like them? You're connected to the same people, you move in the same circles." The vulnerability of his confession had quickly turned into a defensive shield. He stood like a man who had been burned before and was waiting for the fire to start again. Amara felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. She saw the ghost of the man he used to be, the brilliant engineer who once had the world at his feet, hidden beneath the grease and the faded shirt. She realized then that Tund wasn't just a business rival. He was a predator who had built an empire on the broken back of the man standing before her. The complete evil silence she had felt when her car broke down was nothing compared to the silence Ibuka had lived in for years. As the sky turned a bruised purple, Amara knew she couldn't just walk away. She had found a war worth fighting, and for the first time, it wasn't about a land deal or a billionaire's bank balance. The air between them, once cooled by the evening breeze, suddenly felt stifling, charged with a tension that mirrored the electric stillness before a storm. Ibuka stood rigid, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the dirt floor of the shop, while Amara remained on the bench, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The vulnerability he had shown just moments ago, the ghost of the brilliant engineer who had co-founded Lawson Automations, had vanished behind a mask of cold, hard stone. Amara leaned forward, her eyes bright with a mixture of empathy and her natural executive drive to fix what was broken. "Ibuka, listen to me," she said, her voice soft but carrying the authority of a woman used to commanding boardrooms. "Tund and GT engines have been my rivals for a year. They are playing a dirty game, and now I know why. Let me help you. I have the legal backing, the financial support, and the connections to make this right. My lawyers can gather the evidence, and we can take back what he stole from you." But her words, intended as a lifeline, acted like a match to a dry field. Ibuka stepped back, his eyes narrowing until they were sharp, bitter slits. A short, harsh laugh escaped him, one that carried no joy, only the weight of years spent in the dust of a jetty. "Help," he snapped, the words sounding like a curse in the quiet village air. "You Lagos people and your help. It always comes with a price tag, doesn't it?" He began to pace the small area under the blue umbrella, his movements jerky and aggressive, a stark contrast to the calm man who had fixed a radiator. "You show up here in your fine car and your soft clothes, acting like a savior. But you're just like the rest of them. A Lagos shark looking for a new angle, a new design to exploit, or a way to crush your rival using my corpse as a stepping stone." Amara stood up, her palms open in a gesture of peace, but the billionaire CEO within her was beginning to feel the sting of his rejection. "That's not fair, Ibuka. I am being sincere. I saw what you did for me when you had nothing to gain. I am trying to return the favor." "Fair?" Ibuka roared, his voice finally breaking the evening silence. "Was it fair when my own wife handed my life's work to a predator? Was it fair when the courts laughed at a man who didn't have the millions to buy justice?" He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his chest heaving. "I don't trust any of you. Not the suits, not the pearls, and definitely not the kindness of a billionaire who happened to break down on my road. You're connected to the same world that burned me, Amara. How do I know Tund didn't send you? How do I know this isn't just another layer of the betrayal?" Amara flinched as if he had struck her. The accusation was so far from her reality that it left her momentarily speechless. She looked at his grease-stained hands and then at the sharp lines of pain etched into his face. She realized then that his distrust wasn't just a wall. It was a fortress, built stone by stone from every lie he had been told and every dream that had been snatched away. "I didn't ask you to come here," Ibuka continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss that cut deeper than the shouting. "I didn't ask for your pity or your legal team. I had peace here. I had the dust and the silence, and I was fine with that. But you bring the smell of Lagos back into my shop. You bring the reminders of everything I tried to forget." He stepped toward her, his presence looming and cold. "I want you to leave, Amara. Take your help and your silver car and go back to Victoria Island. Stop coming here. Stop looking at me like I'm a project you can fix with a checkbook." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Amara's shallow breathing. Her throat tightened, a lump of uncharacteristic emotion rising as she looked at the man who had saved her career but refused to let her save him. She didn't argue. She didn't use her CEO voice to list the reasons why he was wrong. She simply nodded, her emerald green suit, now dusted with the red earth of a jetty, feeling like a heavy, ill-fitting armor. "Okay," she whispered, the word barely audible. She turned and walked back toward the path, her flats crunching on the gravel. She didn't look back at the blue umbrella or the man who stood under it, cleaning a spanner he had already cleaned 3 times, his heart a locked room to which she no longer held the key. The following days in Lagos were defined by a complete evil silence that even the frantic noise of the city could not pierce. Amara moved through her high-rise office in Victoria Island like a ghost, answering her team with short nods and one-syllable replies that left Nneka watching her with a worried, clinical eye. At home, she sat by her window for hours, watching the city lights of Lagos blink lazily in the distance while her heart held onto the sharp sting of Ibuka's rejection. She felt a profound sadness, not because she had lost a business opportunity, but because she had offered kindness and had it thrown back in her face like unpaid rent. She told Nneka that it hurt to be just kind and be treated like an enemy, but her friend wisely noted that such kindness scares people who are used to war. In a jetty, the air was just as heavy, though for different reasons. Ibuka stood in front of his shop doing absolutely nothing, staring into the road like he was waiting for a silver sedan that was no longer coming. His apprentice, Courage, watched him closely, noticing that his boss had cleaned the same spanner 3 times without touching a single engine. The silence in the shop was suffocating, and even the usual village gossip from Mama Rotamai and Mama Rita seemed to dim in the face of Ibuka's obvious misery. Courage eventually teased him, noting that his lack of shouting was proof that he missed the Lagos lady, but Ibuka simply dropped the tool and walked away, his chest feeling like it was being squeezed by a heavy vice. That night, the sky over a jetty was gray and morning, matching the internal weather of the man who had spent years trying to forget he was a brilliant engineer. Ibuka sat in his small room, the phone in his hand feeling like a lead weight. He had lived so long in the peace of his isolation, but now that peace felt like a prison cell. He realized that in his desperate attempt to protect himself from another betrayal like Fola's, he had become the very predator he feared, lashing out at the only person who had looked at him and seen a man instead of a project. He took a breath, his heart hammering against his ribs, and dialed the number he had no business saving. The phone rang once, twice, and for a terrifying moment, Ibuka thought she wouldn't answer. Then, her voice slipped through the line like wind through a curtain, a soft hello that made his throat tighten. "It's me," he said, his voice low and roughened by days of unspoken regret. There was a long, agonizing pause on Amara's end, a silence that held the weight of all the things he had shouted under the blue umbrella. "I'm sorry," he finally whispered, the words feeling like a surrender. "For the way I spoke to you. For what I said. It wasn't fair." He began to pour out the truth, the words tumbling out before his fear could stop them. He admitted that he had forgotten how to trust, and that he wasn't used to someone showing up and offering help without asking for a pound of flesh in return. He confessed that he was tired of being afraid of the world, tired of living in the dust, and tired of pretending that his heart wasn't just as broken as the cars he fixed for a few naira. Amara listened, her own breath catching as she stood by her window in Victoria Island, the sting of his previous words finally beginning to dull. "I want to trust you," he said, his voice finally steadying. "But I don't know how. I've spent so long expecting the fire that I've forgotten how to sit in the sun." Amara's voice dropped even lower, filled with a warmth that traveled across the miles between the city and the village. "Then let's start small," she suggested gently. "I'm not asking for forever right now. I'm just asking for a conversation." The tension that had held them both captive for days finally snapped, replaced by a fragile, new possibility. They didn't talk about Tund or the legal battle or the stolen designs that night. Instead, they spoke about small things: the weather in Ajeti, the noise of Lagos, and the way the sky looked when the sun finally went down. For the first time in a long time, Ibuka didn't feel like a ghost haunting his own life. He felt like a man who was ready to step out of the shadows and into the light that Amara was holding out for him. The transition from the red earth of Ajeti to the polished marble of Ikoyi was a sensory shock that left Ibuka feeling like a man walking between two different centuries. He arrived in Lagos feeling slightly awkward in a clean shirt and his best denim, clutching a weathered brown envelope that contained the remaining fragments of his former life: the blueprints, the original sketches, and the trademark filings that Tund and Fola thought had been buried forever. Amara was waiting for him at the entrance of a glass-walled skyscraper, her presence as formidable as the building itself. She didn't offer a corporate handshake. She simply nodded with a look of fierce, quiet pride and led him toward the elevators. As they ascended, the complete evil silence of the lift was broken only by the soft hum of high-end machinery, a sound that Ibuka's trained ears recognized as the heartbeat of absolute power. They stepped into a conference room that smelled of expensive leather and old law books, where the air was kept at a temperature so cold it felt like a warning. Waiting for them was Mr. Nicholas, a man with a voice as soft as silk but eyes as sharp as a surgical blade. Amara had described him as a legal storm for Tund, and as he gestured for them to sit, Ibuka realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't the only one who wanted justice. Amara sat beside him, her arms folded and her posture as unyielding as a mountain, her presence a silent promise that she was no longer just a billionaire watching from the sidelines. The first hour was grueling. Mr. Nicholas didn't offer empty platitudes. He asked hard, pointed questions that forced Ibuka to dig through the painful debris of Lawson automations. He laid out the evidence Amara's team had already begun gathering: emails, timestamps, and prototype photographs. Ibuka watched as the lawyer spread out the contents of the brown envelope, connecting the dots between Ibuka's original 2017 designs and the engines currently being sold by Tund's GT engines. As the lawyer examined the sketches, the weight on Ibuka's shoulders began to melt, replaced by a cold, rising fire of realization. "You have a solid case, Ibuka," Mr. Nicholas finally said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "If we move fast, we can freeze their entire production line before they even know the storm is coming." Amara leaned forward, the emerald green of her suit reflecting in the glass tabletop. "We don't come to play, Ibuka. I told you I know people, and I'm not afraid of Tund's deep pockets." She looked at Mr. Nicholas and gave a single decisive nod. "Start the filings. I want Tund, to understand that he isn't just fighting a mechanic, he's fighting me." The legal battle started like a slow-moving thunderhead on the horizon. While Ibuka returned to the village to keep up appearances at his shop, the machinery of Amara's world began to grind Tund's arrogance to dust. Mr. Nicholas fired off a lawsuit that didn't just ask for damages, it demanded a full recall of every unit sold under the stolen designs. When the first legal papers were served to the GT Engine's headquarters, the response was arrogant and dismissive, with Tund's lawyers calling the claims baseless and the hallucinations of a failed mechanic. But Amara and Mr. Nicholas weren't fazed. They had expected the lies. Behind the scenes, Amara was using her own influence to isolate Tund within the Chamber of Commerce, ensuring that his deep connections began to fray. She was no longer just the woman who had broken down on a dusty road. She was the architect of Tund's downfall. Ibuka, meanwhile, found himself caught between two worlds, the quiet peace of his blue umbrella in a jetty and the high-stakes war being waged in his name in the city. Every night, Amara would call him, her voice a steady anchor in the midst of the legal chaos. She didn't just report on the case. She checked on him, asking if he had eaten and if the villagers were still gossiping about the Lagos lady. Through those calls, the billionaire and the mechanic built a bridge of trust that was stronger than any legal contract. They were preparing for the final showdown, a fire and pepper court hearing where Tun's rotten conscience would finally be laid bare for the world to see. Ibuka was no longer afraid of the world. With Amara by his side, he was ready to reclaim his legacy. The morning of the final hearing felt like a thick, pressurized silence before a tropical storm. The Federal High Court in Lagos was a world of cold marble and high ceilings, a place where the fire and pepper of the legal battle was finally reaching its boiling point. Amara Williams arrived looking like a general entering a decisive battle, her emerald green suit replaced by a sharp executive gray that matched the steel in her eyes. Beside her, Ibuka sat straight, his jaw tight, his hands, now scrubbed clean of the ageti dust, resting on the table like heavy weights. Across the aisle, Tund, the CEO of GT Engines, sat with a face so smooth it looked like it rejected wrinkles out of sheer pride. He wore his luxury suit like armor and leaned back with an arrogant, dismissive smirk, flanked by 5 lawyers who looked ready to bury the truth under a suitcase full of lies. The proceedings began with a tense, formal air, but the atmosphere shifted the moment Mr. Nicholas stood up to present his evidence. For the first hour, Tund's legal team attempted to paint Ibuka as a failed mechanic and a disgruntled former employee whose claims were baseless and purely hallucinatory. Tund even allowed himself a soft scoff, whispering to his lead counsel as if the entire affair was a waste of his valuable time. He claimed with absolute confidence that GT Engines had designed their flagship motor in 2018 through their own internal research and development team. However, Mr. Nicholas was not fazed. He moved with the patient, predatory grace of a man who already knew exactly where the trap was buried. "Mr. Tund," the lawyer began, his voice dropping into a low, silk-like tone that commanded the entire room, "you claim this design was born in your labs in 2018. But can you explain this?" With a decisive snap, Mr. Nicholas produced a series of high-resolution photographs and original blueprints. The courtroom erupted into a low hum of whispers as a 2017 photograph was projected onto the screen. It showed a younger Ibuka, standing in his original shed, holding a prototype of the exact same engine. The timestamp was undeniable, and the serial numbers etched into the casing matched the new 2018 designs perfectly. Amara leaned forward, her gaze fixed on Tund, who suddenly looked like he had swallowed a live coal. "This photo," Mr. Nicholas continued, his voice rising in volume, "is dated a full year before your company allegedly invented this technology. We have the original sketches, the metadata from Ibuka's old computer, and the trademark filings that were intercepted by your associates." He then produced the literal receipts, financial records showing the clandestine transfers of design files from Fola's private accounts to GT Engine's offshore servers. Tund's face, once smooth and arrogant, began to crumble. He looked toward his lawyers, but they were suddenly busy shuffling papers, unable to look him in the eye. The judge leaned forward, peering over his spectacles at the document on the bench. "Is this your signature here, Mr. Tund?" the judge asked, pointing to a document that Tund claimed had been photocopied wrongly in an earlier session. Even the court clerk couldn't hide a chuckle at the transparent lie. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate, rotten fear. Tund realized too late that he wasn't just fighting a broke mechanic from a jetty. He was fighting the combined might of Amara's resources and Ibuka's undeniable brilliance. The fire and pepper of the evidence was burning through Tund's defense, exposing the rot underneath his expensive suit. Ibuka sat in his chair, unmoving, as he watched the man who had stolen his life finally begin to drown in the truth. He looked at Amara, who gave him a small, fierce nod of victory. The complete evil silence that had followed his betrayal years ago was finally being replaced by the sound of justice slamming its gavel. The room was in an uproar, but amidst the chaos, Ibuka finally felt a sense of peace that had nothing to do with isolation and everything to do with being seen. As the judge called for a recess to finalize the verdict, Amara nudged Ibuka under the table. "You can celebrate now," she whispered. He turned to her, his eyes wide and finally clear of the pain that had haunted them for so long. The storm had arrived, and while it had leveled Tun's empire, it had cleared the air for Ibuka to finally breathe again. The final verdict arrived 3 months after the courtroom storm, and when the judge slammed the gavel, the sound echoed like the closing of a dark chapter in a long, painful book. Ibuka was awarded full intellectual rights and 72 million naira in damages, while Tun was forced to recall every stolen design that had built his hollow empire. For a moment, Ibuka didn't move. He just sat there blinking as the weight of years of poverty and isolation finally lifted from his shoulders. Amara nudged him gently, her eyes shining with a victory that was as much hers as it was his. She told him it was time to stand up and smile because the man who had been a ghost in a jetty was finally back to claim his future. 2 months later, the red dust of the village was a distant memory as JL Auto Concepts opened its doors in Lekki Phase 1. The office was a masterpiece of glass and steel, featuring executive gray chairs that Amara had insisted upon, though Ibuka secretly ordered champagne beige accents just to keep their playful rivalry alive. The air inside was cold and crisp, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of the roadside shop where they had first met. Ibuka walked through the showroom, no longer wearing a grease-stained shirt, but a well-tailored blazer that fit the brilliant engineer he had always been. Courage, his former apprentice, moved through the sleek workshop with a wide grin, already being called the senior advocate of the new mechanical republic. On the night of the grand launch, after the crowd of Lagos elites and investors had finally filtered out, the high-rise office became quiet. Amara and Ibuka found themselves alone in the center of the showroom, surrounded by the sleek curves of the cars that were now legally and rightfully his. The complete evil silence of their first encounter had been replaced by a comfortable, intimate stillness. Amara kicked off her signature heels, standing barefoot on the polished tiles, while Ibuka leaned against a prototype, looking at her with a gaze that held more than just professional gratitude. They sat cross-legged on the floor, sharing leftover meat pies and sipping wine from plastic cups, a humble echo of their time on the wooden bench in a jetty. Ibuka raised his cup to the woman who had looked past the grease and the poverty to see the man underneath. He toasted the billionaire who had turned her war into his justice. Amara raised hers in return, her heart finally finding the peace she had been searching for since that day her car disgraced her on the road. So Ibuka began, his voice dropping into that smooth, low register that always made Amara's heart skip a beat. "Do you want to continue being just a business partner, or are you ready for something more real?" Amara raised an eyebrow, a playful smirk touching her lips despite the fluttering in her chest. "Is that supposed to be a proposal? Where is the Lagos flair?" Ibuka laughed, a sound free of the bitterness that had once defined him. He knelt on the floor, nearly slipping on the tiles in his excitement, and took her hand in his. "Amara Williams," he whispered, his eyes soft but serious. "I promise to cook you slightly burnt jollof rice and love you with just enough pepper to keep life interesting. Will you be my girlfriend?" Amara laughed so hard she almost fell, the sound of her joy filling the sleek Lekki office. She had spent her life winning contracts and building an empire, but this was the only deal that truly mattered. "Yes," she said through her giggles, "I've been waiting for you to ask since you fixed my radiator with borrowed water." Under the flickering lights of their new empire, the billionaire and the mechanic sealed their love the Lagos way, proving that sometimes, the best things in life are found when everything else breaks down. Thank you for watching this journey of betrayal and redemption. What did you think of Amara and Ibuka's story? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below, and until we bring another intriguing story your way, goodbye for now.